Johannes, John, Minear was born on 11th of February 1730, in Michelstadt, Germany, a small town located a little more than 1 hour south of Frankfurt. He was born to Johann, Hans, Georg Minear and his wife Anna Katharina Meyer. The Minear family immigrated to America in 1732. Sailing on the Mary of London, the family arrived in Philadelphia on September 26, 1732. The family first settled in Conestoga, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Around 1751 John Minear married Maria Ursula. She was born around 1738 in Baden-Württemberg, Germany. Together John and Maria had 10 children. By 1773 John Minear and his family reached the Virginias, and John had begun scouting out an area for a settlement and his homestead. That summer John Minear arrived at Holly Meadows and surveyed the land from Holly Meadows to Licking Falls, Virginia. He found a suitable site for a settlement along the Cheat River, as well as a site for his homestead, in an area known as Horseshoe Bend. He would return the following year with his family and 40 more settlers. Upon his return in 1774, John Minear and his settlers built a crude fortress in the Horseshoe Bend area. The first structure was a large 2-story log house and was surrounded by a 12-foot stockade. The fort was not far from the Seneca Trail, a noted warpath and at times a military highway. There were frequent negative dealings with the local Shawnee and Iroquois population. Consequently, most residents did not stray past the range of the guns at the fort. During the first summer at the settlement, men would spend time outside the stockade clearing forests for crop fields and homesteads, as well as hunting for game, but by autumn the settlers were forced to fall back to the Potomac due to Dunmore's War. Minear, his family, and the settlers would spend the next 18 months there, unable to return to the settlement even after hostilities had subsided due to a land dispute. John Minear, his family, and his settlers were finally able to return to the area in 1776. Many of the original settlers remained but others had left, with a few new groups joining when they returned. Upon their return, another fortress-style building was erected on Minear's new site along the Cheat River. The new fortress was a long 2-story log-style building, just like the first fort, but this one had palisades. The site of this second fort would later serve as the land for the local courthouse. While the new fort was being built, John Minear returned to Moorfield, which sat along the Potomac River and 80 miles away over the Alleghenies. This was in order to bring back iron works so that the first sawmill west of the Alleghenies could be built. Minear used pack horses to haul the material over the Seneca Trail and back to the settlement. The mill would also serve as a grist mill so the settlers could grit grain, and was the only sawmill in the county for almost 50 years. Being the only sawmill in the county allowed Fort Minear to prosper, and by 1778 it became the center for all settlements in the area. In March of 1780 and through 1781, raiding attacks by the Shawnee and Iroquois had grown more and more frequent and the settlers were in fear of attack constantly. Both the Iroquois and the Shawnee would regularly raid the area. The Shawnee had crossed the Ohio River near Parkersburg, West Virginia in March of 1780 and began raiding through the central counties. News of the raids spread and reaching up the Cheat River, giving the settlers at Fort Minear advanced warning. All but a few families, who had been infected with smallpox, took refuge in the fort. Those who were infected had no choice but to wait for the raiding party to come to them. On the 6th of April, 1780, the Shawnee reached a log cabin about 3 miles away from the fort. It was the home of Bernard Sims and his family. Living with them was a female slave who alerted the family when she spotted the Shawnee approaching. Sims, who had just begun to recover from smallpox, grabbed his rifle and rushed outside to deal with the threat. He was shot immediately by a Shawnee, hiding behind a sycamore tree. As Sims lay on the ground, he was approached by the Shawnee warrior who had shot him, ready to scalp him while his cabin was rushed by the rest of the raiding party. As Sims was being scalped, the warrior noticed smallpox scars on Sims' face and immediately altered the others. The cabin and family were quickly abandoned by the raiding party. News of Sims' murder reached the fort quickly and happened to coincide with an annual trading trip that many of the fort's men were on. The trip would bring the men 130 miles east of the fort, days away from offering any help. To make the fort look strongly garrisoned with men, the residents would continually change outfits and exchange items of clothing to make themselves look like different people. Unfortunately, the settlers of Fort Minear had not fooled the Shawnee and were only led to believe they had done so. The Shawnee had only moved downriver picking a new hiding spot, and raiding and vandalizing the cabins along the way. By the following evening, The men had returned from their trading trip and fear of an attack subsided. Settlers returned to those cabins that had been vandalized the day prior. On the 16th of April, no incidents at the fort or nearby had occurred, and thinking that the occupants were safe, Jonathan Minear, eldest son of John Minear, made a decision to return to his homestead in order to feed his livestock. The homestead was about 2 miles from the fort. Philip Washburn, a brother-in-law to Jonathan Minear, accompanied him on his return to the homestead. About a half-mile from the fort they were joined by Daniel Cameron, who was on his way to his homestead, which was about 3 miles from the fort. After a short walk the men went their separate ways. Once at the homestead both Jonathan and Philip secured their horses, with Philip immediately walking to the fields to feed the cattle. At the same time, Jonathan went to fetch corn to feed the hogs. As Philip was passing a pasture fence he was spotted and seized by the Shawnee raiding party. Not going without a fight, he exchanged fire with the Shawnee around him, but lost the exchange and became a prisoner. At some point, he turned to see Jonathan running toward the river with a dozen Shawnee chasing him. Jonathan had been wounded by a shot to the thigh and was easily gained on by the raiding party. Jonathan gave one last push to escape and ran around a very large tree trying to avoid a tomahawk coming at him, only to lose 3 fingers in the process. The Shawnee at first followed him around the tree while trying to hit him in the head with their tomahawks, leaving deep scars in the tree which were said to have remained for more than 175 years. Eventually, Jonathan lost and was killed by the Shawnee raiding party, who smashed his skull on a nearby tree stump. Philip could only stand and watch in horror as his wife's brother was killed. On the opposite side of the river, Daniel Cameron could only watch, and in his horror also assumed that Philip had been killed. Cameron quickly headed back to Fort Minear to sound the alarm, and it would have taken him some time as he was on foot. Unbeknownst to Cameron, the shots had been heard at the fort. As he was running he ran smack into a group of mounted men. They had traveled the same route as Cameron and had avoided the raiding party. After hearing Cameron's account of the attack the men also decided that both Jonathan and Philip were dead, and rather than risking a revenge mission on a raiding party with an unknown size, they would head back to the fort as it was likely to be attacked next. But again, the Shawnee would not attack the fort, and another day would pass, and by the evening the settlers had a new fear, the possibility of a night raid. But again, no attack came, and the sun brought another day. A search for Philip Washburn was conducted, and when he could not be located the search was expanded till a small trail was found containing a set of different tracks from the rest. These were Washburn's tracks alongside that of the Shawnee raiding party, and it became clear to the men that he had been taken prisoner. The decision was made that once Jonathan's body was buried they would follow the trail and attempt a rescue. At this point, over 24 men, along with a large slave named Moats, were gathered and returned to the homestead of Jonathan Minear in the site of his murder. When the band of men reached Jonathan's homestead they sent Moats to do their dirty work, and check the river and thickets for any Shawnee. Once Moats cleared the area the men located Jonathan's body quickly. It was stiff and bloodied, and still being guarded by his faithful dog. Jonathan's body was taken back to Fort Minear where he was buried. The site of his burial has been lost over the years. It is believed to be under a chestnut tree around a half-mile east of St. George. The day after Jonathan Minear was buried as many men as could be spared, including his brother David, headed out on a rescue mission, tracking the raiding party over 2 days. The party had not returned immediately to Ohio and continued to look for more settlements to raid. By the second night, the rescue party had found the Shawnee camp. David Minear got as close as possible to assess the situation and to make sure the Shawnee still had Washburn. They did. David retreated back to tell the others what he had seen. It was dark already and the rescue party decided to attack at once, catching the Shawnee off guard. David and the others killed 3 Shawnee and wounded 3 others while the rest of the Shawnee scattered into the woods. Philip Washburn was rescued but was badly shaken by the whole ordeal. He returned to the fort with the rescue party. In April 1781, John Minear had to travel to Clarksburg to validate and register his land tracts. Minear and 5 men, Daniel Cameron, Frederick Cooper, Salathiel Goff, Andrew Miller, and Henry Miller, set off to Clarksburg at the beginning of April. It is clear that the men made it to Clarksburg, as John Minear entered 2 land tracts for himself, one for 400 acres at the mouth of Pleasant Creek and the second for 400 acres opposite Clover Run, which included his settlement that started in 1776. On the 5th of April 1781, the group began to head back to Fort Minear. On their way, just 2 miles from Philippi, and about halfway to Fort Minear, the group was ambushed by a group of Shawnee. The path they were riding down was very narrow in some parts, forcing them to ride single file, which gave the Shawnee the advantage in an attack. By the time the men realized what was happening, it was too late. Shots were fired by the Shawnee from the trees, killing John Minear, Daniel Cameron, and Frederick Cooper instantly. Salathiel Goff and Andrew Miller had been dismounted in the confusion and took off running into the woods. Henry Miller had managed to keep mounted to his horse and took off galloping back towards Clarksburg, managing to keep ahead of the Shawnee and survive. Andrew Miller ran towards a steep hill with several Shawnee in pursuit behind him. Armed only with knives and tomahawks, Miller knew that if he pushed hard enough, he could possibly escape. Miller crested the hill and kept going down the other side, and headed for Fort Minear on foot, keeping ahead of the Shawnee for some time till ultimately they gave up and let Miller go. As Andrew Miller ran up the hill, Salathiel Goff ran in the opposite direction, breaking through the line of Shawnee and heading for the river. As Goff got to the river, he looked back, unable to see any Shawnee. He made the decision to try and swim across. He took off his coat and jumped down the embankment, just in time to hear the Shawnee catching up to him. Goff pitched the coat into the river and found a small hole or den to hide in, concealing himself. After a few minutes, the Shawnee noticed his coat floating downstream and thinking he had drowned, was under it, or had come up downstream, went in pursuit of the coat. Goff, sensing his opportunity, took off on foot, also heading to Fort Minear. Both men were able to get back to the fort in time to warn of the coming Shawnee attack. The attack never happened as scouts from the fort had also run into a Shawnee raiding party, and managed to escape, bringing back the same information to the fort and alerting other settlements along the way. With the element of surprise taken from the Shawnee, they pulled back, and Fort Minear was spared. Another settlement was not so lucky. The Shawnee turned their attention to settlements in the Tigard Valley, which would become one of the worst massacres in West Virginia history. The loss of these 3 men was a huge blow to Fort Minear, as they were the leading men of the settlement. Once Miller and Goff had made it back to the fort, a group of settlers from Fort Minear went back to the site of the ambush. On April 5, 1781, they found Minear, Cameron, and Cooper where they had fallen, and scalped. It was impossible to get all 3 men back to the fort without incurring danger, and so they were buried not far from where they were killed. It is said they were buried in the hollow of an old fallen tree. Several decades later, the bodies would be found by road crews, who interred them nearby, after an elderly gentleman who had been acquainted with them men identified them by their distinct teeth, or lack thereof. The Shawnee raids that took the lives of John Minear and many of his men that year and the next would be the last of the raids in what is now Tucker County, West Virginia. After Minear's death, Salathiel Goff would take over as leader of the settlement at Fort Minear. By 1893, Fort Minear, renamed St. George, began to decline. This was because during that year, a group of townsmen from nearby Parsons broke into the courthouse and emptied it of all its records. The records were taken to Parsons, and Parsons would become the official county seat. Without being the official county seat, it also meant that the railroad had no reason to run a line into St. George. Due to these issues, St. George would not prosper into the thriving town, clearly envisioned by John Minear and the settlers that had followed him. On the 29th of July, 1928, the descendants of John Minear had erected a memorial for him, but by 1948 it had been destroyed and the grave went unmarked. Years later, the grave would be located and a new marker was erected not far from where the settlers' graves were. Today, St. George is a sleepy little town that has a population of 74 people and there are just 46 houses in the entire town. The nearest big city is Pittsburgh, which is 2.5 hours north of St. George. The fort no longer exists. Disclaimer: the photographs and paintings portraying the characters in this video are fictional. They are for illustration purposes only. The images of the fort are actually Fort Pickett, located in Fairmont, West Virginia. Again, for illustration purposes only. Thanks for watching.